The Xbox is one of the most enigmatic consoles ever made. There are so many questions surrounding it. Why did Microsoft, a company best known for Windows and Office, suddenly turn toward video games, an industry that seemed completely outside their wheelhouse? How did Microsoft try to challenge Sony, the giant of the time, whose PlayStation 2 was smashing every sales record? How did Microsoft push Nintendo to change its strategy? And how did the Xbox, even without being a massive commercial hit, quietly influence the video game world? Inside Microsoft, there were internal divisions. On the outside, there was war with Sony, filled with harsh insults. At launch, the Xbox broke sales records, only to later fade into obscurity. Today, we're retracing the absurd and unlikely path of the very first Xbox, how the last newcomer managed to secure a place in one of the most competitive markets in tech, and how it quietly reshaped the gaming industry. This is the story of the Xbox, the chronicles of a connected, American, and unpredictable console. It's 1994, and Microsoft is swimming in success. Windows, in just a few short years, has become the most widely used graphical operating system in the world. Fortune magazine named Microsoft the most innovative company in the United States. Microsoft Office is also a huge success, generating enormous revenue. The company has become one of the most powerful in the world, and Bill Gates has become the richest man alive. On top of that, Microsoft had just launched a $100 million promotional campaign, aimed at reaching an even larger audience. And as a great relief to the firm, after more than 5 years of litigation, the legal battle with Apple ended with no ruling against Microsoft. Everything seemed perfect, as if nothing could go wrong. Then on August 24, 1995, Microsoft released Windows 95. A brand new version of its operating system, with a completely redesigned interface, and according to Microsoft, one huge innovation: the Start menu. That single addition made computers much easier to use, at a time when operating a PC was not something accessible to everyone. The success was immediate. Some newspapers reported 4 million copies sold in the first 4 days. That was massive, and Microsoft projected sales of 50 million within the first year. Windows 95 quickly became a phenomenon, achieving Microsoft's goal of bringing computers to the masses, which were moving out of offices and increasingly finding their way into people's homes. And then, all of a sudden, Microsoft turned sharply toward video games. Unexpectedly, Bill Gates began appearing in gaming magazines, talking about video games. Microsoft started highlighting video games as part of its operating system, and they invited gaming journalists for interviews at their office. This was surprising at the time, especially since the industry was in a crucial period. The PlayStation and the Saturn had just launched in Japan and were starting their battle. Things intensified with the famous E3 1995, when Sony launched a fierce attack on Sega, unveiling the surprise US release of the Saturn, followed by the PlayStation, which quickly took the lead. Later that same year, Nintendo hosted its famous 1995 Shoshinkai event, where the Nintendo 64 was revealed along with the groundbreaking Mario 64. Microsoft was keeping a very close eye on all of this. But why would Microsoft, a company selling operating systems and office software, take such an interest in video games? Well, even if its name wasn't synonymous with gaming for most people, Microsoft wasn't entirely a stranger to the field. Each year they published a few PC games, including the highly respected Flight Simulator, Hover, and Fury 3. But now Microsoft had decided to accelerate and show increasing interest in this market. There were even rumors back in 1994, before Sega's Saturn launched, that Microsoft had offered to develop the Saturn's operating system, an offer Sega refused. But that still doesn't answer the question. Why was Microsoft suddenly so interested in video games? Even today, many people struggle to understand why Microsoft turned to a market that seemed so far removed from its core business. At the time, Microsoft was motivated by four main reasons. The first reason was that video games were a market experiencing explosive growth. Analysts predicted the market would double within just a few years. More importantly, Sony had just entered the space with its PlayStation, breaking apart a vision that many American companies held at the time. A lot of people thought video games were an almost impenetrable industry, requiring specific know-how, and that Sega and Nintendo held too firm a grip for other companies to thrive. High-profile failures like Atari's Jaguar or Panasonic's 3DO only seemed to reinforce that belief, but Sony was proving otherwise. Sony had the great intelligence to recognize its lack of in-house expertise, and instead of trying to produce mediocre games itself, it recruited third-party developers and publishers, enlisting their know-how to fuel its console. The second reason came from another company, Silicon Graphics. Silicon Graphics sold development workstations that were ahead of the competition, especially in handling 3D graphics. Some of their machines were even used in big-budget films like the famous Jurassic Park, whose stunning special effects amazed audiences. This was a market mostly hidden from the general public, but the business of selling development stations for games or anything related to 3D was so attractive to Microsoft that they bought Softimage, a company with an excellent 3D animation program available only on Silicon Graphics systems, and released a Windows version of it. The third reason was that the business of developing and publishing games on Windows was extremely profitable for Microsoft. To give you an idea, in 1992, Microsoft had only 2 employees working on it. By 1996, they had more than 80. Their published games sold well, but so did accessories because Microsoft also sold controllers and joysticks. Once again, they made an acquisition, this time Exos, a company that manufactured force feedback joysticks, which Microsoft planned to bring to market. But the fourth and most important reason driving Microsoft's interest in gaming was reputation. Up until then, games on Windows had a poor image. By Bill Gates' own admission in interviews, you practically had to be a computer expert to install games before Windows 95. Some games even had return rates of 35% in stores because players simply couldn't install them. That hurt the operating system's reputation among gamers. These gamers had often felt excluded from the console market, since Nintendo and Sega marketed their systems primarily to young audiences outside Japan. But Sony was changing that, targeting an older demographic, and Microsoft wanted to capture part of that audience as well. Most of all, they wanted to get rid of Windows' image as a nightmare for playing games, because Bill Gates wanted his operating system to be able to do everything for everyone. So Microsoft loudly proclaimed that, with Windows 95, installing games was now much simpler and accessible to everyone, and that Windows 95 was a true gaming platform. But more powerful than words, Microsoft had just released one of the biggest revolutions in PC gaming, a revolution called DirectX. DirectX is an API, an interface linking the computer's hardware with demanding applications like video games. It allowed games to be developed, installed, and played much more easily than before. Before DirectX, when a developer created a game for Windows, they had to manually adapt it to work with most of the hardware of the time. Different graphics cards, different sound cards, different processors. It was a nightmare. Now developers only had to make their application or game compatible with DirectX, and they could be sure it would run on any computer with Windows 95 installed. And DirectX was more than that. It also included online features with Direct Play, graphics features with Direct 3D, and more, but we'll have time to go into that in my video on the history of PC gaming. Very quickly, developers showed strong interest in Windows 95 and DirectX, which solved one of the platform's major flaws. On the one hand, the PC gaming market was considered wide open. On the other hand, developing for Windows cost very little. For comparison, to develop for the PlayStation in 1996, you had to buy a $20,000 development kit from Sony, while for Windows, you only had to pay $500 a year to access all the documentation. But Microsoft didn't stop at releasing DirectX. They bought another company, yes, another one, called RenderMorphics, the creators of Reality Lab, a graphics API highly respected in the industry because it allowed fast and relatively simple 3D development. And more importantly, Microsoft partnered with SoftBank to create a company called GameBank, which specialized in porting console games to Windows 95. Microsoft handled negotiations with publishers to secure the rights. Suddenly, there was a flood of major games arriving on Windows 95, with up to 75 planned, accessories included, with big names like LucasArts, Acclaim, Electronic Arts, and even Sony Interactive. Among these were major hits from consoles like Gex, Ridge Racer, Tekken, Street Fighter, Mega Man, and even Virtua Fighter. Flagship games of this new generation of consoles would also be available on PC. And on top of that, Microsoft announced 4 new titles with so-called realistic physics. Very quickly, Microsoft's machine went into full motion to provide games for its operating system. But the Microsoft game that enjoyed the greatest success at this time was Age of Empires, a historical real-time strategy game that let players step into the shoes of a warlord of an ancient civilization across 4 different eras. Microsoft's strategy was progressing well, and according to one of its executives, 40% of home PCs were turned on primarily to play games. In 1996, to push Windows deeper into the mainstream, Microsoft advanced on 3 fronts simultaneously: the Internet and its slow but revolutionary democratization, multimedia, especially video, and finally, video games. But to be even more present among gamers, Microsoft even launched arcade cabinets. It sounds crazy, but they partnered with Cybernetics to release arcade machines running a modified version of Windows 95. These allowed players to play games like Quake and Diablo online directly from arcades. Meanwhile, 1997 was marked by the explosion of the PlayStation. Sony's consoles spread at an incredible pace, thanks both to the flood of major games finally arriving on the platform and to the rampant spread of piracy, especially in Europe. The PlayStation surprised everyone and dominated its rivals, Nintendo 64 and Sega Saturn. But the success of the PlayStation was making Microsoft really nervous. First, consoles were becoming monsters. The PlayStation matched PCs in handling 3D, and even managed textures on 3D objects better, something surprising, considering the console sold for 1/6 the price of an equivalent computer. Then there was the Nintendo 64, that delivered incredible gaming experiences that seemed far beyond what PCs could do at the time. Titles like Mario Kart 64, with its fully 3D real-time races, GoldenEye shocked audiences with its motion capture. Star Fox 64 and F-Zero X that just launched were extremely impressive. Microsoft realized the defining trait of the gaming market at the time. It was evolving at an incredible speed. Every quarter, groundbreaking games appeared with major technical improvements, and all at affordable prices. But what worried Microsoft most was that Sony wasn't just marketing the PlayStation as a game console. They also marketed it as a multimedia device, emphasizing its ability to play audio CDs. This bothered Microsoft because they felt it encroached on the territory of personal computers and, by extension, Windows. And on top of that, the console targeted an older audience, precisely the kind of demographic that might otherwise be interested in buying a PC. Then at the beginning of 1998, a rumor spread. Microsoft was developing its own console, with a planned release at the end of 1999. The rumor grew quickly, and some competitors started to worry. Howard Lincoln of Nintendo even warned that it would spell bad news for Nintendo, given Microsoft's massive resources. But Bill Gates always insisted otherwise. For him, there was no question of making a game console. Every time he was asked in interviews, he explained that a PC was far more interesting than a console, even if PCs couldn't fully replace them, and that it wouldn't make sense for Microsoft to build a new console. In reality, since 1995, Microsoft had been asking itself the question, should we design a console or not? Sony's arrival frightened Microsoft as it threatened their business. In a 1995 report written by Alex John, Eric Engstrom, and Craig Eisler, employees in Microsoft's multimedia division, They noted that Sony's strategy of relying on third-party publishers for its console games could backfire if Microsoft managed to attract those same developers to another platform or to the PC. That was essentially what Microsoft tried to do with the DirectX, but the PlayStation was selling so well that the vast majority of developers flocked to it, abandoning other platforms, Sega Saturn, the Nintendo 64, and even PCs of the time. Microsoft was starting to realize that to compete with Sony, they needed a product that directly rivaled the PlayStation. In other words, a console. But for Bill Gates and many high-ranking executives, there was still no question of Microsoft producing a game console. And yet, one event would soon leave the company with no choice. The middle of 1998 was marked by a major event. Sega unveiled its new console, the famous Katana, renamed Dreamcast. It was a shock to the industry, the most powerful console on the market, arriving incredibly early. It impressed with its handling of 3D, its polygon count, but also because it embraced the internet. What really surprised people, though, was that the Dreamcast was compatible with Windows CE. Windows CE was a special version of Microsoft's operating system, designed for embedded systems and optimized for devices less demanding than a full computer. That meant developers could build games using the Windows development environment. The Dreamcast launched in Japan on November 27, 1998. Its release, however, was tricky because it coincided with the hurricane that was Ocarina of Time, a game that shattered every record and captured all the attention for months. As a result, the Dreamcast struggled to win over Japanese players. To make matters worse, 1998 was the single best year of the PlayStation's entire history, with sales surpassing even the already sky-high numbers of 1997. The Dreamcast was arriving at a delicate moment. Sales fell below expectations, and even worse for Microsoft, developers had no interest in Windows CE. Although it simplified development, it added an extra software layer that made games far less performant than when developers built them the traditional way, handling every step of the process themselves. Very quickly, studios began ignoring Windows CE altogether, which meant they stopped buying Windows-based development kits. And another reason the Dreamcast was quickly overshadowed was that 1998 was also the year when rumors and wild speculation about the successor to the PlayStation reached fever pitch. Sony officially claimed nothing was in development, that they weren't working on the next console, but everyone knew that wasn't true. Rumors were everywhere. New leaked images appeared every month, and the PlayStation 2 was already on everyone's mind, even though it hadn't been announced yet. It was incredible. A console that didn't even exist yet was already eclipsing all the others. Everyone was curious to see what Sony would do after the PlayStation. Even Microsoft was curious. They went as far as to promise working with Sony on the architecture of its next console, a proposal that was never answered. Then in March 1999, Sony invited developers and journalists from all over the world to present the technical specifications of its new system. It was madness. The console was presented as an absolute monster, constantly compared to PCs of the time, with Sony insisting it would be far more powerful than even the latest computers on the market. Sony announced that it had developed the most powerful consumer processor ever made, and that it would only be available in their new console. They backed it up with 9 technical demos that blew people away. Realistic faces, detailed cars with light reflections. It was a shock to everyone, and the PlayStation 2 instantly became the stuff of dreams and fantasies. But that wasn't all. Ken Kutaragi explained Sony's new vision for a console, not just a gaming device, but an entertainment system for the whole family, able to connect to the internet and other films and music through Sony's services. Sony was encroaching directly on the turf of PCs, not just by comparing the PS2 to computers, but also by talking about online services. Microsoft felt personally attacked by this new vision. Bill Gates finally gave his approval for Microsoft to start thinking seriously about the idea of a console, not to begin building one, but to conduct a study of what might be possible. And since this was Microsoft, the first thought was naturally, which company could we acquire? Logically, the only acquisition that seemed possible was Sega, which was in serious trouble. Joachim Kempen, who worked at Microsoft from 1983 to 2003, recalled, "There were three big manufacturers: Sony, Nintendo, and Sega. There was often this discussion about whether we should buy Sega or not, but Bill Gates didn't think Sega had enough strength to stop Sony. We talked about it many times, but Sega was a different story. You always heard about Sony and Nintendo. They seemed a step above Sega." Meanwhile, internal teams at Microsoft began working on the project on their own, and two different visions emerged, championed by two separate groups. The first was the DirectX team. They wanted to build what they called the Direct Xbox. The idea was simple: literally create a PC disguised as a game console, plain and simple. That meant Windows inside, that meant components evolving in power over time, that meant the ability to play PC games. But it also meant longer startup times and a machine that wouldn't necessarily be fully optimized for gaming. The other team was Web TV, a Microsoft project at the time. Their idea was much more traditional: a true console, designed from the ground up with a custom processor, a custom graphics chip, in short, a fully new console with hardware tailored for gaming running Windows CE. And as in many American companies, these teams were locked in constant competition. This created enormous tension and soon tore the company apart because many executives supported the Web TV team's vision, while many others supported the DirectX team. Still, others thought building a console was a stupid idea for Microsoft altogether. The conflict escalated so quickly that on May 5, 1999, Microsoft organized a massive meeting with its top executives, including Bill Gates himself. Ed Fries, a senior figure at Microsoft, remembered, "I was approached by the guys from the DirectX team. They had this idea for a Direct Xbox, and what interested me was that they literally wanted to make a PC that pretended to be a console. That's what they explained to everyone, and that's what they explained to Bill Gates. But there was also another team trying to convince everyone of another kind of console, and things escalated really fast. In typical Microsoft fashion, we involved our vice presidents, who in turn involved their vice presidents, and eventually it ended in a meeting with the top executives in the two teams. The other team explained their idea of a fully custom console, built from scratch with tailored components. They argued it would be cheaper to manufacture and that consoles sold for around $300. Our idea, on the other hand, was to disguise a PC as a console. So we simply explained that their concept of a fully custom console didn't fit with Microsoft's overall strategy. Logically, our idea was the one that was chosen." But the worst was yet to come for Microsoft. The real shockwave came at the Tokyo Game Show in 1999. This was it, the big day. Sony officially announced the PlayStation 2, showcasing its monstrous specifications. They claimed it could handle 66 million polygons per second, 6 times more than the Dreamcast, which had barely launched outside Japan. Sony also revealed backward compatibility with PlayStation 1 games, the new DualShock 2 controller, and finally unveiled the design of the PlayStation 2, a design wildly praised as modern and stylish. The presentation was already impressive, but it became even more so when Sony announced that not only would games use DVD discs, but the PlayStation 2 would also be able to play DVDs and CDs easily without any additional accessory. This was a bombshell, since everyone had assumed the opposite. And on top of that, Ken Kutaragi announced that the console would be able to connect to the internet, not just for online play, but for many other uses. Do you remember Microsoft's 3 key directions to push Windows further into the mainstream? Internet, multimedia, and gaming. Well, the PlayStation 2 did all 3, and did them all in a single device, sold at a far lower price than a PC, with far more games available and the massive PlayStation brand backing it. And to top it all off, Sony explained that you no longer even needed a PC if you owned a PlayStation 2. You could install Linux on it, plug in a mouse and keyboard, and it would still cost far less than a computer. Sony painted a picture where personal computers would be made obsolete by the PlayStation 2. Cheaper, more powerful, and packed with more features. They even explained that for businesses, it would make more sense to buy PlayStation 2 units than PCs running Windows. Ken Kutaragi summed it up in a single sentence: the PlayStation 2 will redefine what a game console is, but it will also redefine what a computer is. Microsoft panicked after this announcement. They were used to dominating their sector without real competition, but now they felt threatened. It was obvious that the PlayStation 2 was going to be something enormous, and Sony seemed to have no credible rival. Nintendo was lagging behind and hadn't announced much beyond the fact that it was working on a next console. Sega was collapsing, losing huge amounts of money every week. Microsoft understood perfectly well. It would be up to them to stop Sony. After all, Nintendo and Sega were far too small to face Sony, which was already a giant, but Microsoft was even bigger, with even greater resources. The employees tasked with designing Microsoft's console got to work, and the project began to evolve in a way completely opposite to what they had promised their superiors. Instead of resembling the DirectX team's vision of a disguised PC, it looked much more like what the Web TV team had originally proposed, a console with custom components, a little bit different from just a disguised PC. But something else was even more problematic. Despite their promises, the console could not run Windows. The operating system was simply not suitable for a video game console, which needed immediate access to resources. To compete with the PlayStation 2, they needed a technical monster, and Windows would slow performance down too much. They hesitated for a long time because including Windows was extremely important to Microsoft. The console was supposed to be seen as an extension of Windows, but they had no choice. They would have to move forward without it, and they knew this would be incredibly hard to explain to Bill Gates. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Kevin Backus and Rick Thompson later recalled, "It was becoming more or less what the Web TV team had proposed. Microsoft would build its own custom components, and there would be games made specifically for the console, and not just PC games anymore. We went to see Bill Gates and told him that the console wouldn't use Windows. We literally needed napkins to wipe off the spit, because Bill was screaming at us so hard. He was furious, absolutely furious that we had misled him, and he had every right to be. But after about half an hour, he calmed down and said, 'Okay, I understand your choice. Now get out of my office, you bunch of idiots.'" The design team began buying high-powered Dell PCs and dismantling them, trying to reuse their components to build prototypes. In reality, what they wanted was to have another company manufacture the components in bulk. But no one wanted to partner with Microsoft because mass-producing hardware was a risky business with slim profit margins. Remember, game consoles themselves didn't make money. The profit comes from royalties on the games. Microsoft quickly realized they would have to design, manufacture, and produce the components themselves, and that meant costs far, far higher than they had originally planned. Inside the company, the project was even renamed Coffin Box, because several employees were convinced its failure would bury their careers. All these changes led to what employees later called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 2000, the Xbox design team had a crucial meeting with company executives, including Bill Gates, where they had to explain all these changes and, above all, deliver the bad news. Once again, employees vividly remembered that meeting. Bill Gates was 15 minutes late, and he was irritated. He walked in yelling, slammed his fist on the table, and shouted things I won't repeat. Basically, he told us we were killing Windows. He threw the PowerPoint deck on the table and shouted, "This is a insult to everything I've accomplished in this company." Ed Fries tried to speak, and Bill shut him down. Robbie tried to defend the plan, and Bill yelled at him too. Ballmer looked at the PowerPoint, at all the money it was going to cost us, and he started yelling about the astronomical sums involved. The DirectX was marginalizing Windows and doing serious damage to Microsoft. The meeting went on for a long time, and it was going nowhere. So we started thinking maybe we should just cancel everything after all. It was too expensive, too risky, too much of a suicide mission. But then the conversation shifted back for another hour to Sony and the PlayStation 2, what they were calling a supercomputer, and what we should do about it. Suddenly, one of the vice presidents stood up and asked, "But what about Sony?" Everyone stopped. Everyone realized Sony must have gone through this too, and that we had to stop them. Bill Gates turned around and said, "I think we should do it. We should go ahead. We'll approve your plan and give you whatever you need. You wanted $500 million for marketing? You'll get your $500 million. You wanted to move into another building for peace and quiet? We'll move you." It was incredible that everything was finally decided in just 5 minutes. It was the strangest meeting of my life. And just like that, Microsoft was ready to throw itself body and soul into the battle, prepared to use its immense resources to create a console that would have to take on the giant PlayStation 2. This was the beginning of a war for control of the living room, one that some journalists would later call the War of the Century. The project kept growing, and the codename became Project Midway, referencing the Battle of Midway in World War II, a battle the United States won against Japan. Microsoft began working with AMD on the console's design, which was progressing well, and rumors started flying about a console built by Microsoft. Those rumors grew more and more persistent, and players could hardly believe it. The giant Microsoft was going after video games? It sounded unreal, but then again, Sony's arrival had sounded unreal too. The bad news was that with this change in direction, the console would take much longer to design and manufacture. Where Microsoft had once imagined they could launch a console in mid-2000, now it was at least early 2001, which would leave the field wide open for the PlayStation 2. What emerged from this process was a very Microsoft machine, outsized and ambitious. The PlayStation 2 had made a huge impression with its performance and tech demos, so Microsoft wanted to go even more powerful. They kept taking apart PCs and salvaging parts to try to design this console. That's when a very interesting idea struck them, using a hard drive directly inside the console. It sounds basic today, but at the time consoles didn't have hard drives or anything like it. They only had RAM. They stored no information. Game saves were on memory cards. Ed Fries recalled this unusual choice. During development, we decided to integrate a hard drive into the console, and we thought it would be a revolution. Having extra storage meant we could pre-install games, so they launched much faster. Games could use it to store data, and we could even work on the idea of downloading games over the internet. We told Bill Gates it was the console's secret weapon, that it would let us do things no other console could do. We could also cache games, which would make them look better and run faster. Bill Gates pushed the team to build an ever more powerful console, and to keep it under $300, Microsoft contacted every hardware company they knew and pitted them against each other until they had monster components, while also creating a simple development architecture after consulting many developers and publishers to learn exactly what they wanted. Another point the development team insisted on was integrating an Ethernet port to connect the console to the internet. That sparked debate because it was exactly what Sega was trying to do with SegaNet, even offering the Dreamcast for free to those who subscribed, a wild promotion that still didn't take off. The sense was that the internet didn't really interest players. After a lot of discussion, Bill Gates voted in favor of adding an Ethernet port and designing the console with the internet in mind, because the internet was part of Microsoft's overall strategy, because they were already achieving online play with DirectX, which included Direct Play, an API for local and online players. Strangely, one of the most divisive points was the name of the console. The development team called it Xbox, short for Direct Xbox, but the marketing team hated the name. They thought it sounded ridiculous, so they produced a massive list of better names for the machine and stuck Xbox at the very bottom, then ran a user panel test to prove Xbox would finish last, and it was a terrible name. Instead, Xbox was by far the panel's favorite, even though it was listed last and even though marketing disliked it. They had no choice. The console would be called Xbox. One of the biggest projects was the controller, and that turned into a bit of a circus. Microsoft had just hired Denise Kadhari, who knew nothing about video games, and they wanted her to design the controller precisely because she was an outsider with a fresh perspective. Except not quite. She had to work from sketches drawn by Horace Luke, the creative director, because senior leadership had already approved them. And on top of that, the controller PCBs, circuit boards, had already been ordered. Normally you design the shape and ergonomics first and then fit the circuit board inside. Here, they had to do it the other way around. The design was fairly inspired by Sony's DualShock, but Chadhari decided to place the left stick higher than the D-pad, like on the Dreamcast, because that's the thumb's natural resting position. And remember, some players and journalists at the time had complained that the sticks sat too low, making them less natural to reach on Sony's DualShock. Her biggest problem, though, was that the PCBs were enormous. When Microsoft tried to negotiate with Mitsumi, the supplier of the DualShock's PCBs, Mitsumi flatly refused to supply the same kind of boards to Microsoft without further explanation. It seems Japanese nationalist sentiment played a role, with Mitsumi preferring to side with Sony, a Japanese company, even though the deal could have been highly profitable. So Chowdhury had no choice. She had to design a huge controller to fit those oversized PCBs, doing her best to make it comfortable in the hands since the size was non-negotiable. The pad ended up 3 times larger than Sony's DualShock 2, a monster. Why were the boards so big? Partly because building a controller isn't trivial, but mostly because Microsoft decided to include 2 expansion ports on the pad, one of which would be used later by the headset. After some player testing, American gamers actually liked the enormous controller, so Microsoft stuck with it. Microsoft Japan was furious about this giant controller. They explained that Japanese players generally have smaller hands, and they also prefer compact devices. Nintendo had been criticized in Japan for the size of its Nintendo 64 controller, even though, as Miyamoto recalled, its size was fine in the US and Europe. The Xbox controller was so huge that Microsoft Japan told third-party publishers not to start working on the machine until the controller changed. There was even a petition from major Japanese developers refusing to make games on Xbox until the controller's size was addressed. Microsoft set that aside and focused first on a US launch, planning to rework the controller for a possible Japanese release. While all this chaos was unfolding, Sony launched the PlayStation 2 in Japan after a massive and very unusual promotional campaign. The launch sent shockwaves through the gaming world. At 6 a.m., freezing streets of Japan were packed with such huge crowds that police had to supervise the rollout. It was completely insane. All weekend, the streets were filled with thousands of people waiting in line. In just 2 days, Sony sold 1 million PlayStation 2 units, setting the biggest console launch in the history of video games. Microsoft expected a strong debut, but the images from the launch put them under intense pressure. They had to move fast. Everyone knew Microsoft was building a console, but now they needed something concrete immediately and couldn't let Sony run away with the market. And that is exactly what Microsoft did. On March 8, 2000, at the Game Developers Conference, Microsoft showed this.
We're ready to go. Well, we do have one box. This is our show box. Now, is it... This is the box that we take to trade shows and events like this. Currently, inside it has...
The reveal hit like a thunderclap. It was official. Microsoft, one of the most powerful companies in the world, was building an entirely new console. And technically, it was a monster, far above Nintendo's announced GameCube, far above the PlayStation 2, far above contemporary PCs. The console specifications were phenomenal. Microsoft also announced DVD playback, like the PlayStation 2, which was off to a blazing start partly thanks to that feature, an Ethernet port for internet connectivity, and stunning tech demos. The demos looked so good that magazines wrote that if games looked anything like them, the Xbox would crush the PlayStation 2. And surprise, in the spec sheet you could see AMD had disappeared, even though they'd been in all the earlier prototypes. In their place were an Intel Pentium 3 processor and an NVIDIA graphics card, proof of Microsoft's approach of pitting all suppliers against each other until the last moment, and the architecture ended up being very close to that of a PC. There was also an 8 gigabit hard drive, huge for the time, 4 controller ports, and a target price of just $300, cheaper than the PlayStation 2. It was an extremely convincing presentation. Microsoft showed up with something truly heavyweight, enough to terrify the other manufacturers. And at E3 2000, which followed soon after, Microsoft raised the console's specs even further, especially the processor, and explained that they had already started distributing development kits. E3 2000 was ultimately a fairly quiet show. Nintendo didn't show its new console. The PlayStation 2 only had a handful of titles on display, and Microsoft managed to stand out thanks to the attention its new console attracted. Still, one thing was missing from Microsoft's presentation: games. Almost no titles were announced, and the console's lineup was still completely unknown. That worried journalists, and rightly so. Then again, the same could be said of the PlayStation 2. As I explained in its dedicated documentary, the PS2 launched with a lineup that failed to impress, and in Japan, it was actually DVD sales that exploded alongside its release, while game sales numbers disappointed. So Microsoft began discussions with a huge number of studios and third-party publishers, and as often, they started shopping around among the big developers and publishers. Rick Thompson and Kevin Backus recalled, "We met with Larry Probst, the CEO of Electronic Arts. He asked me, 'Who are you? I've already worked with Microsoft and I don't know you.' I answered, 'Console.' And he said, 'You don't know what it means to make a game console. You have no idea what that involves.' I left thinking it hadn't gone very well. We met with Electronic Arts half a dozen times, and every time they reminded us that Microsoft had a tendency to try all kinds of things, but as soon as something didn't work, they'd drop it and move on as if nothing had happened. That wasn't a big deal for Microsoft. It was just a line item in the accounts. But for a publisher like Electronic Arts, it was another story. Larry kept repeating, 'I want to know who gets fired if this doesn't work.'" And according to several serious sources, Microsoft even tried to buy Electronic Arts, which politely refused. That wasn't the only developer or publisher they tried to acquire. Microsoft even went as far as trying to buy Squaresoft, the studio behind Final Fantasy and many other legendary franchises. Bob McBreen recalled, "We had a letter of intent to buy Square. Early November 1999, we went to Japan and had one of those big dinners with their CEO. The next day, we were sitting in their meeting room, and they said, 'Our treasurer would like to make a statement.' And the treasurer said, 'Square cannot go through with this deal because the price is too low.' We packed our bags, flew home, and that was the end of Square." This attempted acquisition reached Sony's ears, and it seems to have been one of the reasons that pushed Sony to directly take a stake in Square. Microsoft tried to buy many video game companies, but very few were interested. Microsoft didn't have the best reputation, and even though negotiations with the publisher Midway went fairly far, no agreement was reached. Japanese companies in particular didn't look kindly on this aggressive approach. So Microsoft decided to take a more cautious approach, secure game deals first, and only then consider buying studios. They negotiated with Tecmo for the return of Ninja Gaiden after years of absence, as well as Dead or Alive. They focused on showing off the technology of their console more than the business details, and that proved more effective with Japanese developers. But still, that wasn't enough for Microsoft. They attempted a massive move by trying to partner with Nintendo. Bob McBreen recalled, "We had Nintendo over in January 2000 to work on the details of a joint venture and to give them all the technical information on the Xbox. The idea was that their hardware was lousy compared to PlayStation. So the proposal was that they would handle the game development while Microsoft took care of the hardware. We met with them 7 times, and we thought they were interested." Kevin Backus even remembered the moment they went as far as trying to buy Nintendo. "Steve Ballmer had us meet with Nintendo to see if they'd consider an acquisition. They just burst out laughing. Imagine someone laughing at you for an hour straight. That's basically how the meeting went. So Microsoft, in a move many thought absurd, tried to buy Bungie, a studio making PC games, in order to bring them onto Xbox, because the game they had shown at recent events, Halo, had caught Microsoft's eye, as well as that of many journalists. The industry was deeply skeptical, as Kevin Backus and Ed Fries recalled. I got a voicemail from Neil Nicastro, the CEO of Midway, saying we were the dumbest people in the industry. He could understand if we didn't want to buy them, but why buy a PC game developer? Everyone thought it was stupid, and the guys at Microsoft Japan said, we're not even going to release Halo on console because, as everyone knows, as immutable as the laws of physics, first-person shooters don't work well on consoles. After the acquisition, we put Bungie in separate offices so they'd be left alone, and they especially didn't want us bothering them. Microsoft even did what they called a color palette analysis, and they brought me this report explaining that the colors used in the game were the wrong ones and needed to be changed, but I never passed that report on to Bungie. Despite a lot of failures, Microsoft did manage to secure a good number of games and developers for its console, including big names like Capcom, Namco, Konami, Activision, and more. The project was starting to take shape, with a release announced for fall 2001 the following year. And time was short because the PlayStation 2 launched in the US and Europe at the end of 2000, and it was a phenomenal hit. Sony's orchestrated shortage led to scenes of players fighting to get their hands on a console. The PS2 not only had a head start, it also already had an incredible reputation, something the Xbox announcement hadn't shaken. And it wasn't just Sony. Nintendo finally revealed its GameCube at Space World 2000, showing off games like Luigi's Mansion, eye-catching tech demos featuring Zelda and Mario, and a new controller that was already generating excitement. Meanwhile, Microsoft sent a flood of information to magazines and websites, with interviews listing all the developers and publishers they had negotiated with to support the Xbox. Even if the list seemed too big to be believable, developers were impressed by how easy it was to make games on the platform. Microsoft also made waves with the announcement that Peter Molyneux and his studio would shift toward Xbox after producing classics on PC like Populous and Dungeon Keeper. That helped Microsoft approach the goal of 30 launch titles, alongside exclusives already announced like Oddworld. But competition from the PlayStation 2 was fierce, and Sony reacted quickly. For example, Microsoft kept loudly promoting the Xbox's 8GB hard drive as a major advantage. Sony immediately talked about a hard drive add-on for the PS2's expansion bay, signaling that they wouldn't give an inch to their competitor. Microsoft had to strike hard, and immediately, because the competition was so intense, it was already overshadowing their console. And that's exactly what they set out to do in early 2001 with a memorable presentation. We arrive at the very beginning of 2001 at the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, an American trade show dedicated to new electronic products, where video games have become less and less present after the creation of events dedicated exclusively to gaming like E3. And yet it was on January 6, 2001, at this CES, that Microsoft finally revealed its new console.
We're unveiling the Xbox. This is the product that will be out later this year, and there's an amazing amount going on. Working with partners who help build the hardware, working with the software developers, working with the retailers. The program around this thing is really quite phenomenal. But the box itself is another thing that we put a lot of energy into. So this is the Xbox. And so, for the first time, let me now unveil Xbox. One of the unbelievable things here is that we have a hard disk, and so the information about the game will already be stored. You don't have to load it off the disk or load it as you move from level to level. We support HD TV or all the other connections you've got. The resolution here is really unbelievable. The graphics power is over 3 times what's been available before.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Yeah, I might want to use that sometime, Bill.
The presentation was remarkable in every sense of the word. Bill Gates unveiled Microsoft's very first console alongside an appearance by The Rock, a professional wrestling star at the time. And yet the reveal itself felt a little unusual. Gates described the console in very general, abstract terms. Compared to Nintendo's GameCube reveal a few weeks earlier, where every design choice was clearly explained, all the games were shown, and even the controller design was detailed, this was far vaguer. But it wasn't about misleading players, it was about making them dream. Microsoft was in a different position than Nintendo. Nintendo needed to convince quickly, respond to criticism, and prove it still mattered in the looming Microsoft versus Sony battle. Microsoft, on the other hand, didn't need to say much. Their console was already highly anticipated, if only out of sheer curiosity. What could one of the world's most powerful companies build? Microsoft understood that, and so they kept things intentionally vague. The flashy X-shaped prototype that had caught attention earlier had been swapped for a more conventional design to reduce production costs. Microsoft had already said that the X design wouldn't be final anyway. The new look was well received in America, a huge black console with green accents. Horace Luke, who worked on the design, explained that the goal was to create a console whose appearance reflected next-generation technology, a design that would visually represent the machine's raw power, resembling high-end audio equipment. Its size was an issue, but Microsoft explained they had no choice. Its massive power required a big power supply, which in turn made the console large. They quickly diverted the debate, though, by highlighting that they had engineered it to be acoustically isolated, after hearing many complaints about the loud noise made by the PlayStation 2 and Dreamcast during use. The green accents scattered across the console and controller were there because, according to Jay Allard, gamers love the color green. It resonates in terms of energy, power, and mystery. And remember, when Sony launched the PlayStation 1, they were worried that entering the gaming world might damage the company's image, so they created a separate brand, PlayStation, and avoided showing Sony's name or logo in ads, or even on the console's box at the beginning. Microsoft did the same, creating a new brand, Xbox. That's what appeared everywhere on the console and controller, with Microsoft's own name barely visible. But in their case, it wasn't because they feared tarnishing their corporate image. Rather, they feared that the Microsoft and Windows brands might create confusion, that players would see the console as just a disguised PC and not a real console. The console's innovations were highlighted: 5.1 surround sound, controllers using USB ports to make accessory development easier, the built-in hard drive, the internet connectivity. Journalists relayed these features as true revolutions for consoles, but what convinced everyone of the console's monstrous power was the demo of a game called Malice. The demo was so beautiful and stunning that journalists said it looked on par with the best animated films, a true graphical showcase. And while the demo of another game, the upcoming Oddworld, was much less convincing, the fact that Microsoft had stolen the franchise's exclusivity from Sony caused a stir, since Oddworld was a well-respected IP at the time. Microsoft also continued announcing more titles, including the next Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which would feature an online mode exclusive to Xbox. But strangely, while Microsoft kept announcing games, the number of launch titles dropped from around 30 down to just 15. What was happening? Why the sudden drop? The answer was, in Sony's experience, the PlayStation 2 had launched with more than 30 games in some territories, but almost all of them sold very poorly. The console itself sold well, but not the games. Having seen that, Microsoft explained, "We prefer to launch with 15 quality titles rather than 35 mediocre ones, as on the PlayStation 2. Still, this presentation revealed two major problems for the Xbox. The first, despite earlier suggestions, the Xbox would not play DVDs out of the box, something that baffled many. Why wouldn't it, when the PlayStation 2 did? Microsoft explained that unlike Sony, which was selling a general-purpose entertainment device that also played games, Microsoft wanted to sell a real console targeting gamers rather than families. They added that Xbox would still play DVDs through an accessory, but behind that odd justification was a less glamorous truth. If the Xbox had included DVD playback by default, Microsoft would have had to pay licensing fees for every single console produced, which would have driven up the retail price. So instead, they sold a separate accessory that unlocked DVD playback. The accessory itself was licensed, keeping the console's price at around $300. Even though this news was received coldly, worse was still to come: the controller. The journalists and developers who tried it hated it. They described it as too big, not ergonomic, too heavy. Edge wrote that the 6 buttons felt mushy, the triggers were stiff, the right stick got in the way of the buttons, and the D-pad was imprecise and plasticky. They went on to say its size was a real problem. One developer even declared it the worst controller he had held in a very long time. Microsoft defended its design, saying they had tested it with players and found it to be the most suitable shape, but nobody was buying it. And finally, the last piece of bad news: the Japanese launch was delayed by several weeks, and the European launch by several months. Microsoft was focusing on a US release first, fully aware that Japan would be an extremely difficult market to crack, and that Sony already had an enormous grip on Europe. Even though these setbacks seemed to cast a shadow over the presentation, in practice they didn't. The reveal was covered everywhere, with magazines publishing huge features on everything there was to know about the console, along with plenty of praise. Everyone was relieved. Microsoft hadn't gone halfway. They had delivered on their promises. They hadn't made a portable PC that could play games. They had built a monstrous console that looked capable of competing with the PlayStation 2. Suddenly, the gaming market had 4 main home consoles, where just 6 years earlier there had only been 2, Nintendo and Sega. But those 4 consoles wouldn't be at war for long. Just a few weeks after Xbox's presentation, Sega announced its withdrawal from the console market. Sega would continue to develop and publish games, but it would no longer produce hardware. That was the end of the Dreamcast. The PlayStation 2 had completely suffocated it. Sales had already been insufficient even before Sony's console arrived, and they collapsed after. Sega came within a hair of bankruptcy. It was an earthquake in the gaming world. After so many years, so many consoles, so many milestones, Sega would never again be a major hardware player. This decision made everyone realize that the video game world had changed, that it was now a sector dominated by the world's largest corporations, Nintendo excluded. For Sony, it was a golden opportunity. The PlayStation 2 had been desperately short of games, and now it would even receive titles developed and published by Sega. It was the jackpot. Sony lost a competitor but gained a massive publisher. Just weeks later, Crazy Taxi, developed by Sega, came to the PlayStation 2 and became one of the year's best-selling games. And this happened just as Sony launched Gran Turismo 3, finally a major hit on the console. Not only was it gorgeous, but it showcased the PS2's technical potential, and it quickly sold over 1 million copies. But Microsoft also seized the opportunity to negotiate with Sega. As a result, Sega announced 11 games for the Xbox. Almost none were exclusives, and Sega was still leaning more toward the PlayStation 2, but it was still a boost for Xbox. And Microsoft also secured support from the world's biggest publisher, Electronic Arts, which brought a strong lineup, especially its sports games, which were crucial to a console's success. Even better, EA committed heavily, announcing 10 games for the console's first 6 months. Then came GameStock, followed by the Tokyo Game Show. The Xbox game announcements started pouring in. Amped, Fusion Frenzy, NFL Fever, Project Gotham, Dead or Alive 3, Neverland Saga, Metal Dungeon, and many more. It was an impressive list in terms of sheer numbers, but most of these titles were virtually unknown and not particularly anticipated. The Tokyo Game Show also made it clear that Microsoft was betting heavily on the Japanese market. They had already redesigned the controller into a smaller shape, closer to the GameCubes, which seemed better suited to that market because Microsoft Japan had flat out refused to sell the other model. For the time being, though, this smaller controller would be Japan only. Not only that, Microsoft also recruited high-ranking former Sony employees with deep connections across the Japanese industry, people like Toshiyuki Miyata, to leverage their relationships with local publishers and developers. Microsoft even went so far as to open a studio in Japan specifically to create games for the Japanese market. But the Tokyo Game Show was also a stage for Sony and Nintendo to show their new games, their hardware, and plenty of other updates, news that was extremely well received. The manufacturers were matching each other blow for blow. In that context of open warfare, we arrived at E3 2001, which promised to be completely wild in a pivotal year. Nintendo kicked things off with a conference about the Nintendo difference and a trailer for a new Smash Bros. A reveal that sent journalists into a frenzy. Then they followed up with what they called the new game in the Mario series, and Nintendo promptly undercut itself because this was supposed to be the system seller that convinced everyone to buy the console. While intriguing, it was far from as convincing as Mario 64 had been for the Nintendo 64, and this was only a few weeks before launch. Then came Sony's conference, which really knocked the wind out of Microsoft. A few seconds of various games were shown, a list of titles flashed by, and then a 10-minute demo of Madden. After that came a trailer for the Final Fantasy movie, followed by a very long presentation of Devil May Cry, and a quick trailer for Metal Gear Solid 2. Aside from those already known titles, Sony moved to block Microsoft by cutting them off at the knees. They announced an Ethernet adapter for online play, exactly what Microsoft was trying to do with Xbox, and brought up their hard drive again, just like Xbox. Most of all, Sony announced a Linux kit that would turn the PlayStation 2 into a PC, the ultimate affront to Microsoft and Windows. Then it was Microsoft's turn, and they had been completely caught off guard. The presentation was a disaster. Technical problems, awkward jokes, and the only thing that saved the show was Halo, which looked incredibly impressive. Microsoft also reiterated that they would launch Xbox in Japan before Europe, which everyone had already anticipated as a bad idea, since Japan would be much harder to crack. It was fantastic news for Sony. Europe was its playground, and now it would have time to tighten its grip there without competition. The manufacturers' press conferences were disappointing, very disappointing, for such a crucial year. But E3 isn't only about the conferences. It's also a gigantic show floor packed with demos. It was a spectacle. Metal Gear Solid 2, Luigi's Mansion, Halo, Pikmin, Final Fantasy X, Ico, Max Payne, Crash Bandicoot, Devil May Cry, the list went on. And the big winner of E3 was, in fact, Sony, because the vast majority of show-stopping games were set to release exclusively on PlayStation 2. Ken Kutaragi broke his usual reserve to declare that Microsoft had already lost the console war, that they had shown almost no games, and that they didn't understand the video game market. Wow. Microsoft responded timidly, but hostilities had begun. And Sony's attitude also betrayed a certain nervousness at seeing a company as enormous as Microsoft throw itself body and soul into gaming. That became even clearer when retailers reported that Sony was threatening them, telling them not to sell Xbox and warning that if they did, Sony would ship them far fewer PS2 units. Given how well the PS2 was selling, that would mean a huge loss of revenue for those retailers. Sony seemed terrified of Microsoft's arrival, terrified of going from the most powerful company in the sector, capable of suffocating Nintendo and Sega, to a company smaller than the titan Microsoft, with its effectively unlimited cash. By mid-2001, the PS2 finally began getting convincing high-quality games. After Gran Turismo 3, 3 titles made a huge splash: Metal Gear Solid 2, Final Fantasy X, and Grand Theft Auto 3. At last, the PS2's biggest problem, mediocre, not very pretty launch software, was being addressed, and just in time too, with competitors about to arrive. Then on September 14, 2001, the GameCube launched in Japan, and sales were far from incredible, nowhere near the hysteria of the PS2's debut, with figures 5 times lower. Nintendo seemed to be showing up too late. Finally, we reached November 15, 2001, the long-awaited Xbox. The console that had gamers drooling finally launched in the United States, backed by a gigantic marketing campaign plastered everywhere. Bill Gates himself showed up. The launch was triumphant, even more than the PlayStation 2's. Xbox entered the history books as one of the best debuts of its era, beating the PS2's record with 1,500,000 units in just over a month. It was an incredible launch, and even more incredible for the first console from a new manufacturer. What made it even more remarkable was that Xbox pulled this off despite launching in the US long after the PS2, and at the same time as the GameCube, which meant it had to share attention on day one. And yet Xbox outsold the GameCube at launch. Granted, Microsoft had a much larger, much more expensive marketing push, and distribution in the US favored Xbox, but still, it was one heck of a performance. The reason for this strong start lay in the variety of launch titles, from Shrek to Dead or Alive, Oddworld, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X, Madden NFL, with nearly 20 games at launch, more than twice the GameCube's number, covering a wide range of genres. Very quickly, though, one game stood out: Halo: Combat Evolved, which sold 1 million copies out of the 1.5 million consoles sold. It seemed unreal that a first-person shooter originally designed for PC would by far be the best-selling launch title, and it made perfect sense, because the game was a stunning graphical showcase compared to its contemporaries. Every time it was shown before release, it shocked people with its gorgeous visuals, and it single-handedly demonstrated the Xbox's crushing technical superiority over its competitors. But a strong launch, while an important indicator, doesn't guarantee long-term success. Now the console had to achieve something that had never been done before, an American console conquering the Japanese market and then the European market, arenas where Sony reigned supreme. On February 22, 2002, after a massive promotional campaign in Japan, and once again with Bill Gates on stage, alongside local celebrities guaranteeing huge media coverage with journalists and cameras everywhere, the Xbox finally launched in Japan. And it was a disaster. Only 125,000 consoles were sold out of the 250,000 prepared, which was already a modest number to begin with. Interest in the console was practically non-existent. Worse, games were selling terribly. Microsoft claimed that sales would pick up at the end of the month when Japanese workers got paid, but things got even worse. By the end of the month, many Japanese players were actually returning their Xboxes, which were now turning up in secondhand shops. After 2 months, the console hadn't even passed 200,000 units sold, despite Microsoft's original plan to sell 5 million in Japan. Not a single Xbox game was in the Japanese top 50. It was a crushing failure. In Japan, people simply didn't care about Xbox. So how could a console have the best launch in US history and one of the worst in Japan within just a few weeks? Well, first of all, the console was much more expensive in Japan. It also arrived almost 2 years after the PlayStation 2, which meant a lot of people there already had a PS2, and the GameCube had already launched a few months earlier. Xbox was just too late for the Japanese market, especially for a brand new competitor. To make matters worse, the marketing campaign, though massive, was also incredibly clumsy. It heavily emphasized the American identity of the console, badly underestimating Japanese consumers' national pride. On top of that, Japanese homes are much smaller than in the US. For years, advertisers had highlighted compact products, building the perception that the smaller a device was, the more advanced it must be. But the original Xbox was huge. Unlike the PS2, it couldn't even stand vertically to save space. And even though the controller had been redesigned for Japan, it was still widely criticized. To top it all off, a large number of consoles turned out to be defective. Microsoft insisted that only 1% of units were affected, but the damage to the brand's image was done. Soon after came the European launch.
Mais à Paris, la Xbox de Microsoft n'intéressait pas grand monde.
C'est cher. Trop cher, franchement c'est cher. Excessif. Ouais.
And the images of the French TV report spoke for themselves. It was a catastrophe. People barely paid attention to the console, largely because of its astronomical price. €480 at launch. That's about $800 in today's economy. And this was for a console that released a year and a half after the PlayStation 2 in Europe, Sony's stronghold. It was unthinkable. On top of that, Xbox games cost 50% more than PlayStation 2 or GameCube games. Why such a high price? Partly because Europe was seen at the time as a market where people were willing to spend more on leisure, and more importantly, Microsoft didn't want to sell the console at a loss outside of the US. Both Microsoft and Sony were already losing about $100 per unit sold. Since games weren't selling particularly well, and remember, games are the real moneymaker in this business, it didn't make sense to take bigger losses, and in some European countries, it's also prohibited to sell products at a loss. The results were catastrophic. In fact, Xbox sales in Europe were worse than Dreamcast's. The French magazine Joypad reported that across 28 Virgin megastores, the combined weekend sales of the Xbox were equivalent to what a single Virgin store had sold in just 1 hour during Dreamcast launch 3 years before. Outside the US, the Xbox barely existed. Sensing Microsoft's global struggles and watching US sales decline week after week, Sony struck hard, slashing the PS2's price to $200 in both Japan and the US, with a slightly higher cut in Europe. At this point, the PS2, with its CD-DVD playback and already strong lineup of quality titles, was being sold at a much lower price than the Xbox, which had fewer games and couldn't even play DVDs without an add-on. Meanwhile, the GameCube launched in Europe and easily outpaced Xbox, with 400,000 units sold. Even better, players bought an average of 2.3 games per console, an excellent attach rate for launch, especially with such a small initial catalog. On top of that, the GameCube was priced much lower than the Xbox, and Nintendo soon cut its price to $149 to stay competitive. Microsoft was in deep trouble. They were forced to slash Xbox prices across the board by about 30% in Japan, down to just €300 in Europe and $200 in the US. The console instantly became more affordable, but because it was much more expensive to produce than its rivals, Microsoft was now losing even more money per unit, and despite the cuts, Xbox was still more expensive than the competition. Sony had struck at the perfect time, leaving Microsoft with its back against the wall, but Microsoft remained confident. They had one last card to play. That card was E3 2002, the high point of this ongoing war, where manufacturers were ready to unleash their heavy artillery. And what an E3 it was. Nintendo came out swinging, announcing a ton of titles for the Game Boy Advance, but also a solid lineup for the GameCube. Star Fox Adventures, the phenomenal Metroid Prime, Mario Party 4, and most importantly, two heavy hitters for the holiday season, Super Mario Sunshine, presented with its impressive water jet mechanics and remarkably realistic fluid physics, and The Wind Waker, the long-awaited successor to Ocarina of Time, since Majora's Mask was something quite different. Both were scheduled for the end of the year. On top of that, Nintendo showed Four Swords Adventures and unveiled the new F-Zero game developed with Sega. Nintendo and Sega side by side, it was a powerful symbol. Sony's conference, meanwhile, was weak. It was essentially Sony bragging for the entire presentation, drowning the audience in numbers, statistics, figures, more figures, but hinting at one emerging direction: online integration in games. Overall, it was underwhelming, leaving the door wide open for Microsoft, and Microsoft seized the opportunity. They announced that the smaller, more classic controller, originally designed for Japan, would now replace the bulky, heavily criticized model worldwide, instantly fixing one of Xbox's biggest flaws. But above all, Microsoft unleashed an avalanche of new games coming to Xbox: Psychonauts, Dead or Alive, Panzer Dragoon, Project Ego, Steel Battalion, Deus Ex 2, Splinter Cell 2, the list was enormous. Despite the console's poor sales figures, the number of projects in development was staggering. The only problem was that most of these games lacked reputation. Xbox was missing that one true killer franchise, especially at a show where Nintendo had just revealed a new Mario and a new Zelda. Still, Microsoft had one more ace, a brand new service called Xbox Live. It would let players go online, create a unified virtual identity compatible across games, and play with friends or strangers while chatting through a headset plugged into the controller. The problem was, online gaming wasn't really popular yet. Many players didn't have the right equipment, and most people couldn't imagine which types of games they'd even want to play online. Once again, Sony got away clean because publishers and developers were showcasing an endless stream of new PS2 titles, all without Sony lifting a finger. E3 2002 turned out to be very unusual. Nintendo had stolen the show, and despite Microsoft's solid presentation, it was hard to compete when Nintendo unveiled the successors to Ocarina of Time and Mario 64. Every magazine and website focused on those, while Xbox news barely made headlines. But on September 24, 2002, a shockwave shook the gaming world. Microsoft announced it had acquired Rare. Yes, that Rare, the studio that had been Nintendo's partner for so many years, behind legendary games that marked gaming history, the incredible Donkey Kong Country series, GoldenEye 64, which revolutionized the FPS genre, the excellent Banjo-Kazooie, the extraordinary Perfect Dark. Rare, which had already announced projects for the GameCube, was now bought by Microsoft, one of the most renowned studios in the world. For a company desperately lacking high-quality first-party titles, this was huge. And in one move, Microsoft also weakened Nintendo, which had put on a strong showing at E3. But the acquisition sparked controversy. Many players were frustrated with Microsoft seemingly buying up everything in sight. They felt it was unfair. Microsoft was so much bigger than its rivals. Nintendo couldn't possibly compete with Microsoft's bottomless pockets, and this was no way to play fair. In reality, things were a bit different. Rare actually wanted to distance itself from Nintendo. They even reached out to Sony, and Microsoft simply arrived at the right moment. It was still a gut punch for Nintendo, losing its best third-party developer, and that was only the beginning. Soon after, Nintendo released Super Mario Sunshine. It turned out to be a semi-failure. The game was good, but players and journalists weren't impressed. It followed in the footsteps of the legendary Super Mario 64, which had shaken the entire industry. Expectations were sky-high, and Super Mario Sunshine simply couldn't live up to them. Then came The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker, at the end of the year, and again the result was disappointing. Its cartoon-like art style and the new childlike look of Link deeply upset many fans, who felt it looked too kiddie, while Zelda had always carried a more mature visual style compared to Nintendo's other series. For the first time in Nintendo's entire history, both Mario and Zelda failed to impress, and at the same time. Meanwhile, Microsoft launched Xbox Live in the US, and its start was phenomenal. The 150,000 Xbox Live starter kits sold out very quickly. American players were completely won over, thrilled at the idea of online gaming. Even better for Microsoft, the service launched with 3 compatible titles: Mech Assault, MotoGP, and Ghost Recon. Microsoft also announced that 50 games would be online enabled within 3 months, and that the service would soon launch in Japan and Europe. But once again, the success stayed strictly American. In Japan, Xbox's market share was below 1%, making Xbox Live a non-starter. In Europe, most players simply weren't equipped for online gaming. Setting it up was messy, and for most people, it didn't feel worth it. Online gaming simply didn't capture the imagination of European players the way it did in the US. And once more, Sony stole the spotlight with an incredible year of games. New franchises like Kingdom Hearts and Ratchet & Clank. Big returning series, Medal of Honor, Mortal Kombat, Need for Speed, Tekken 4, Gran Turismo, Hitman 2, and big licensed hits like Dragon Ball Z Budokai, James Bond 007, and Harry Potter. It was an avalanche of titles. And one of them caused an earthquake. On October 27, 2002, Grand Theft Auto Vice City hit shelves. It was a phenomenal success, massively boosting PS2 sales that were already strong. More than just excellent, the game gave Sony's console a rebellious image that strongly appealed to teenagers and young adults. And crucially, it became a smash hit in the US, Microsoft's strongest territory, its top priority. Sony had struck right where it hurt most. Nothing could compete. That Christmas, the PlayStation 2 was flying off shelves, leaving both competitors far behind. 2002 was a year of total domination. Sony steered the ship while Microsoft and Nintendo trailed in the distance. In the UK, Microsoft soon attracted the wrath of the Advertising Standards Authority because of a tasteless Xbox commercial. Many viewers complained that it was offensive and shocking. On the surface, the ad seemed harmless, but it still damaged the console's image in Britain. The ad was banned outright. Coupled with clumsy Japanese and European promotional campaigns, Xbox's marketing was drawing attention for all the wrong reasons outside of the US. The start of 2003 mirrored the previous year. Sony slashed the PS2's price to $179. And Microsoft matched it, dropping Xbox to $179 as well, with similar cuts in other regions, but this time, things went even further. Nintendo introduced its Platinum range, the return of its player's choice strategy from the N64 era, best-selling titles re-released at half price. Sony followed suit with its Essentials, the best, Platinum ranges depending on the region. And once again, Microsoft was forced to copy them, launching the Xbox Classics line, a range of discounted reissues of its best-selling games. But Xbox didn't have the same iconic catalog as its rivals. The move went mostly unnoticed. Some gaming sites didn't even bother reporting it. Then came E3 2003, one of the most disappointing E3s in history. As Sony proudly declared the console war was over and Sony had won decisively, they didn't even bother spending much time on the PS2. Instead, Sony focused on the PlayStation Portable, describing it as the Walkman of the 21st century. And indeed, judging by the other conferences, the war was already over. All the manufacturers were looking ahead. Satoru Iwata, now Nintendo's president, announced that Nintendo was already working on its next console, just a year and a half after the launch of the GameCube. Microsoft also centered its presentation on online gaming, showing quite a few titles, especially Halo 2, which everyone was desperately waiting for after the shock of the first game. Another title, Fable, drew attention as a new type of RPG. Microsoft, too, talked about a new console in the works. Everyone understood the gap created by the PS2 was too wide. It was impossible to catch up, time to prepare the future. And 2003 only confirmed that vision. Once again, a flood of PS2 games hit the market, some of them highly original, like iToy Play, which used a camera to track players' movements. At the end of the year, Mario Kart Double Dash released. Like Sunshine, it divided fans much more than its predecessors. Microsoft finally got Grand Theft Auto on Xbox in a double pack of Vice City and GTA 3, but this was a full year after the PS2 versions, and the wave had already passed. The release barely made a ripple. A few Xbox titles stood out: SSX 3, Project Gotham Racing 2, Topspin, but overall it was very weak compared to the PS2's offering. And if 2003 felt quiet, it was only because in 2004, a storm was about to hit the video game world. The first months of 2004 were unusually quiet for video games. Aside from the usual price drops, there wasn't much being announced, and some magazines even talked about the Xbox going through a game drought at the start of the year. Microsoft tried a big move to finally win over Japanese players. They slashed the price to about $150, $30 less than the PlayStation 2 in Japan, offered plenty of game bundles, even aired a TV documentary, but none of it worked. The Xbox just wasn't appealing, and sales numbers stayed ridiculously low. The only thing drawing attention was Sony's first handheld console, a system the company was heavily investing in, and a brand new machine announced by Nintendo. And then came E3 2004, one of the most spectacular E3s ever. Sony finally unveiled the PlayStation Portable in detail, and it blew everyone away instantly, a technological gem that people couldn't wait to get their hands on. Nintendo fired back right after by revealing the Nintendo DS, a console with two screens, one of them touch-sensitive, compatible with Game Boy Advance titles, and backed by a lineup of games. The press went wild. Caught in between, Microsoft didn't have much to show. Their big announcement was that Electronic Arts would finally support Xbox Live, along with a handful of game reveals that nobody really cared about. The Xbox was getting crushed by the looming handheld war. Every eye was on the DS versus PSP showdown set for the end of the year. But Microsoft had just quietly revolutionized gaming. It was now possible to buy downloadable content online, what we now call DLC, through Xbox Live. Jay Allard celebrated, "With the ability to add downloadable content now on Xbox Live, we're taking a big step forward in keeping the gaming world up to date and bringing a major innovation to the industry." A little later that year, Microsoft launched Xbox Live Arcade, an online store where you could buy and play classic or smaller games straight from the console. Prices were steep. $10 for something like Pac-Man or Pole Position seemed outrageous at the time. Still, by 2004, Microsoft announced Xbox Live had already surpassed 1 million online users, a massive number considering how few consoles they were selling overall. 2004 ended up being the Xbox's strongest year in terms of games, with well-received titles like Ninja Gaiden, Splinter Cell, Pandora Tomorrow, Burnout 3, a slew of sports games popular in the US, and Fable, a game hyped for years as the RPG that would revolutionize gaming. But when it launched, Fable disappointed critics. Journalists wrote that it wasn't without flaws and nowhere near as groundbreaking as promised. Still, Fable would get overshadowed almost instantly by one of the most important Xbox releases ever, Halo 2. The long-awaited sequel, delayed multiple times since 2002, finally dropped in November 2004 and made history. In just 24 hours, it generated a staggering $125 million in revenue, breaking the record for the biggest entertainment launch ever, even beating the opening of Pirates of the Caribbean at the box office. That was thanks to Microsoft's massive marketing machine. What's truly crazy is that Halo 2 pulled this off on a console that wasn't even selling that well. By far the Xbox's best-selling title, it also took full advantage of Xbox Live with downloadable multiplayer maps. But Sony had an ace up its sleeve. Just before Halo 2 launched, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas hit the PlayStation 2, and it went on to be the best-selling game of 2004 in the US, moving over 5 million units in just 3 months, and same in Europe. After 6 months, it had sold 12 million copies, nearly double what Halo 2 managed. Once again, Sony was running the show, leaving little room for competitors, even though Microsoft wasn't doing badly. San Andreas wouldn't reach the Xbox until June 2005. By then, far too late. Everyone already had it on PS2. The end of 2004 and beginning of 2005 was defined by the massive handheld war between Sony's PSP and Nintendo's DS, two totally different versions of gaming. Sony marketed the PSP as an all-in-one multimedia device, while Nintendo pitched the DS as a brand new way to play. The battle dominated all attention. The aging Xbox completely fell off the radar, barely a mention on gaming sites or in magazines. Early 2005 was a wasteland for the console, with almost no big releases. Strangely, this went against the usual trend, where a console's last years are filled with a flood of games, as had happened with the PS2. And even with the Nintendo 64, despite its weaker sales, the Xbox, though, was practically abandoned. That raised questions. Was Microsoft about to drop out of the console business after taking such a beating from Sony? Everyone was looking to E3 2005 for answers. The stage was set for a legendary showdown. Nintendo was about to reveal its revolutionary next console. Sony's next PlayStation was rumored to be a technical monster, and Microsoft, nobody knew if they would quit or double down with new hardware. Microsoft pulled a surprise move. They unveiled their next console, the Xbox 360, not at E3, but just a few days before, during a special broadcast on MTV, a channel aimed squarely at teens and young adults, Microsoft's main target. The event was less about specs and more about style, flashy design reveals, a dedicated concert, a few gameplay clips, and a chaotic youthful vibe. Then at E3 a few days later, the Xbox 360 appeared again with a major presentation, right alongside Sony's new PlayStation 3, which wowed crowds with jaw-dropping visuals, and Nintendo's new Wii, which electrified the audience with its unique approach. E3 2005 was legendary, but it also marked the end of the original Xbox. The spotlight had shifted to the future, and with the 360 launching later that same year, long before the PS3, it became clear why the first Xbox had been winding down with so little activity. Microsoft and third-party publishers had already moved on. Even so, 2005 still saw some standout Xbox titles: Half-Life 2, Burnout Revenge, Psychonauts, and especially Forza Motorsport. By the late 2005, the Xbox 360 had arrived almost simultaneously in the US, Japan, and Europe. The original Xbox's life was over, and a new console war had begun, one we'll look at in the next video. It's easy to think of the first Xbox as a failure. After all, its job was to slow down the PlayStation 2, and it absolutely didn't. The PS2 crushed its competition and went on to become the best-selling console in history, which it still is today, though maybe not for much longer. The Xbox probably didn't put any real dent in the PS2's momentum, and on top of that, it cost Microsoft an enormous amount of money, billions of dollars. It's hard to imagine any company other than Microsoft having the financial muscle to absorb such losses. And then there's its short lifespan. The Xbox was only on the market for barely 4 years, which is extremely short for a console, especially compared to the PlayStation 1 or 2. But it would be dishonest to sum up the console only like that, because in just 4 years, and despite its low sales, Microsoft's Xbox had a huge impact on the industry. First, it gave Microsoft invaluable experience. This wasn't a gaming company. They had no experience in the console business. They were a software giant whose biggest product was Office. Making a console was practically the opposite of what they did, and yet they went from nowhere to second in the world since the first Xbox outsold Nintendo's GameCube. And in those years, they learned a massive amount: how to design hardware, how to market it, how players behave, what gamers actually want. All of that knowledge would serve Microsoft well in the years to come. On top of that, the Xbox brought real innovations that left their mark on gaming. The hard drive and all the possibilities it unlocked would become standard in later consoles, but its biggest revolution was Xbox Live. The idea of an online service tied to the console itself, complete with a friends list, voice chat, and a unified system, was unheard of. Everyone thought online gaming was strictly a PC thing. Microsoft proved them wrong. Every element of Xbox Live was adopted later: online multiplayer, digital stores, downloadable content, even access to older games. There's also an overlooked innovation: custom soundtracks. Players could store their own music on the hard drive and play it directly in certain games like MotoGP, State of Emergency, or Forza Motorsport. It was a brilliant feature, later copied by Sony and still shows up in some games today. The Xbox also gave birth to incredible franchises like Forza, Fable, and of course Halo. The success of Halo had a massive impact on the industry. It proved, alongside other titles, that first-person shooters didn't just work on consoles, they could dominate. It kicked off the wave of console FPS games that would follow: Call of Duty, Battlefield, BioShock, Borderlands, Far Cry, Left 4 Dead, and many more. Sure, GoldenEye 007 launched earlier, but it didn't spark a huge trend the way Halo did. Maybe the biggest change Microsoft brought, though, was shifting gaming toward a more American focus. Before Xbox, console gaming was dominated by Japanese companies, and most games were designed first and foremost with Japanese audiences in mind. Microsoft flipped that by publishing tons of titles aimed squarely at the US market. That shift only grew stronger in the years that followed, and beyond that, the entry of a tech giant like Microsoft helped legitimize gaming itself, especially in the US and Europe, where it still carried a stigma of being just for kids. With Microsoft's serious image, advanced tech, and marketing aimed at older players, gaming started to be seen as entertainment for all ages. And overall, having a new heavyweight in the industry was a good thing for players. More competition meant more investment, more developers, more variety in games. Microsoft's entry played a big role in making gaming the massive global form of entertainment it is today. In the end, despite its wild launch in the US that hinted at huge potential, the Xbox stumbled in Japan and Europe. Its price was too high, and Sony's PS2 had an overwhelming head start, boosted hugely by its built-in DVD player, which made it a mainstream hit. But Sony wouldn't be able to pull the same trick twice. When the Xbox 360 launched ahead of the PlayStation 3, it set the stage for a new chapter in this war of giants, a chapter Nintendo would also take advantage of. But that's a story for another video. I truly hope you enjoyed this one. It drained all my energy, like every console history video I make. But in the end, I'm incredibly proud and happy to bring you content that I believe is well-researched and high quality. Thank you so much for your support, your likes, your comments, your subscriptions, and your shares. They mean the world to me and give me the strength to keep going. See you very soon for the next one. Take care.